All right, everyone. I want to start pretty promptly. It's 6, maybe 01 at the most. Welcome to the Rainwater Harvesting Workshop. My name is Raluca Mihalcescu. I'm the Water Conservation Coordinator with Arizona Water Company. I want to thank Gold Canyon Community Incorporated for helping us put on this workshop. They help us select the space and work through all the logistics. So I'm really grateful for our partnership with them to be able to make these workshops happen for the community. This is our 3rd workshop that we've done in Gold Canyon. If you haven't attended the previous 2, they are online, so you can go and attend them. This workshop is going to be recorded and posted on the Facebook page and the YouTube page. So if you have friends or don't know what to do on a Friday night and want to watch this workshop again, you will be able to. Some quick logistics before we get started, because I'm not the presenter tonight. If you need to use the restroom, it's out and to the left. Basically what we're going to do is we have our main presenter, Kaylee Colter. I'll let her introduce herself. But she's going to be presenting till about 7:15, and then we'll pass it along to Phil from Tank and Barrel. He's the one that donated the 55-gallon barrel that we're going to raffle away. If you did not grab your raffle ticket, you don't want to miss that. So you can go get a raffle ticket. We'll do that at the very end, but he's going to talk a little bit about his products and his services with this company, so that way if you're interested in any of this and want some help, we have a resource there available to you. And then whatever time we have left at the end for questions, that is going to be available. Also, some quick handouts. So we do have a handout that Kaylee put together just with some quick equations that she'll go over during the workshop. And from what I understand, this is to take home and reference when you get home if you need some reminders on these equations. We also have a post-workshop survey, because I know everyone loves doing a survey, but this is really imperative to help us continue to improve these workshops and to understand what is working and what you would like to see more or differently. And then also some information from Phil with Tank and Barrel if you want any of his information and some photos of what his products look like there. And then just a contact card for Phil if you want more information and want him to contact you about services. So I think I've covered everything. With that, I'll just hand it over to Kaylee. That way we can jump into the content as soon as possible.
Great. Is it possible to turn the air down a little bit too?
Oh, to make it cooler? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's warm in here, isn't
Okay.
it?
I'm not, all right. Thank you much.
There
Okay.
we go.
All right, so thank you guys. What a packed house. This is really nice. I don't always get such a great turnout. My name is Kaylee Colter. I am a landscape architect, so I practice here in the greater Phoenix metro area. Basically meaning I don't really go down to Tucson, but anywhere up here in the valley. Like I said, I'm a landscape architect, and I have my certification in rainwater harvesting as well. Yeah, but my passion is really working with residential clients to bring the kind of sustainable techniques that we use in landscape architecture to your homes and your landscapes at home. So today we'll talk about rainwater harvesting. We're going to kind of talk about the basics. We're going to cover some vocabulary just to help you kind of get the lay of the land. And then we'll kind of do a really initial introduction into how you can apply that to your site or your property. And then at the end, we'll also go through some, there's tons of nuance in all of this, and it's a 101 class, so we're not going to get through everything, but I'll kind of touch on some of the details that are important as you start your design process. So just out of curiosity, how many people here have a specific project in mind that you're thinking of, that you're here to learn and apply? Okay, how many are just kind of generally interested in rainwater harvesting and want to, okay, great, okay, cool. All right, well, we'll get started. There's something for everybody. So first I'd like to talk a little bit about why harvesting rainwater. Why do we want to even put in the effort to do this? I am so surprised I so frequently get asked, is it even worth harvesting rainwater? We get so little rain, like why even bother? And to me, I always answer that, well, because of that reason, it's just so much more important that we harvest that water, that we use all that water as a resource, because we don't have a lot of it. And so we should be using it thoughtfully. So some of the things that we can do with rainwater and why we'd want to harvest it, first of all, is kind of obvious, is to use it as irrigation. Rainwater is really great for irrigating plants in your landscape. And the other thing is that when you are harvesting rainwater, you're actually also doing stormwater management, right? Because all of that rain is rain from stormwater, and so if we're managing it with our rainwater harvesting systems, then we're making sure that we're reducing flooding risk, we're reducing, all the risks that are associated with, those big storms, especially the monsoons that we get that are so, well, when we get them, that can be really forceful, and the water comes down really quickly. And so we do see flooding damage, and so managing that stormwater with a plan in mind helps reduce that risk. And then the other thing I like to point out too is, we've done a lot of conservation work, the municipalities and water companies in the valley, and they find that about 70% of municipal water use is actually used outdoors. So when you are harvesting rainwater and offsetting how much water you're using outside for irrigation, it really is a large amount of the water that you use. So some of these pictures are just examples, of how we might use water outdoors, right? I mean, that includes things like, washing your car and, spraying off the sidewalk, but, it can include watering your plants. And that may not be a thing that we see as wasteful. Like, we want to be able to do that. We just want to do it the most efficient way possible. That top image where we've got sprinklers that are spraying all over the sidewalk and the water's running off on the sidewalk is maybe a less efficient way for us to be using that water as a resource. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of rainwater harvesting, it's really great for us from that kind of personal perspective of reducing our water use, but it really makes a big impact on our urban environment. So this image just shows kind of a idealized pre-development condition. So here with the trees, there's no buildings, there's no urban development. As opposed to, on the right-hand side where we start to have, lots of urban development, lots of pavement, lots of concrete. And in that first scenario, we get about, between shallow and deep infiltration, maybe 50% of stormwater, so 50% of rainfall ends up making its way into the ground. When we increase how much impervious surface that we have, concrete, asphalt, that kind of thing, we've reduced that down to maybe 15%. And so this has a really big impact on the quality of the environment too. We're kind of starting to see that, especially I see that this year, where we're not getting a lot of storm events happening in our really urban Phoenix area because of this kind of heat island effect. So some of the benefits of harvesting that rainwater is we're allowing the water to infiltrate into the soil. It can support vegetation. Vegetation is so important for cooling the environment. You can see how much of that water gets lost through evapotranspiration, and that's what helps cool the environment, right? If you ever use a swamp cooler, it's that same process. So part of it, is that really personal, helping you reduce your water use, but it's also part of the bigger picture. So what are the basics? We're going to kind of go through some essential concepts and terminology and start there. So one good question to get out of the way before we start, is rainwater harvesting legal? This is a great question because rainwater harvesting is, regulations vary by state to state. So wherever you are actually going to implement this, you do need to look up those regulations in that state. But in Arizona, yes, it is legal. There's no state regulation or municipal codes that prohibit rainwater harvesting. Now, most municipalities will have some rules about creating, negatively impacting your neighbor's property. So whatever you do design, you need to make sure that the water leaves your property the same way it did before you start your project, i.e. you don't want to create a problem where you're flooding out your neighbor. That is regulated for good reason. And then there may be some smaller regulations, like, HOAs and some municipalities might have some regulations about if you're going to use a tank. Sometimes they'll limit like how tall that tank is. They don't want to see it over the fence. But that's really case specific. So again, you'd need to look into your HOA requirements. All right. I want to cover a little bit of vocabulary here because it can kind of get jumbly. So there's a couple of different types of rainwater that we're talking about when we're talking about water harvesting. So rainwater is the basic. It's water that falls on your property, falls on your roof or falls on your landscape. It can all be harvested. It's easy to access, easy to use. This is generally very clean water. Stormwater is a little bit different. So stormwater is water that's entered the stormwater system. So that might be as simple as it has entered into the curb and gutter. That doesn't look like a really complex system, but it is part of our stormwater management system. And the difference with stormwater is that it tends to have a lot higher pollutant level, right? Because it's picking up stuff from the street. And so if you started to get into stormwater harvesting where you wanted to bring stormwater from the street into your landscape, there are a lot more hurdles to jump in order to be able to do that, because most of the time it will require a curb cut or something like that to get the water onto your property, which requires permitting and permission from whatever municipality you live in, and may require permits. It just kind of depends on the municipality. I mention it because, especially in Tucson, a lot of the rainwater harvesting started with stormwater harvesting like that, bringing water in from the street into these street side basins. And I just want to point out, the difference there. And then the last term, we won't talk about this a ton in this presentation, but I just want to make sure you guys are aware of it because it's we include it in the water harvesting suite, is gray water. Gray water would be water that's recycled from inside your home and has been through, a gray use. So it's not 100% clean water, but it's not brown or black water. And so this would typically come from sources like your shower, bathroom sinks, laundry is a big one. And so depending on that source, that water can actually be used in your landscape. You do have to pay attention to making sure you're using the right soaps and detergents and that kind of thing, but it is possible. And in fact, the laundry to landscape is one of the lowest cost, easy to implement ways to use that gray water. So the great thing about gray water is you're not dependent on it raining in order to be able to use gray water. So if you're looking to incorporate a lot of exotic fruit producing trees, meaning citrus or deciduous fruits, stone fruits, peaches, things like that, gray water is a really great resource to look into and is also legal in the state and very easy to permit. All right, so we're going to get into rainwater harvesting. We can actually break it down a little bit. So we generally kind of divide it into two types, what we call passive rainwater harvesting and active rainwater harvesting. Passive systems are more simple systems, reliant on earthworks and grading to move and collect water. Our active systems are those where we start to incorporate more infrastructure, things like tanks and cisterns. So some differences between the two. Some, might be a little bit obvious, but so passive systems rely on modifying the earth using grading and other techniques that basically increase storage capacity and the ability to store water in the soil. So basically what you're doing is trying to capture that water and hold it and allow it to infiltrate on site in the ground. Passive systems generally have lower upfront costs, right? It's kind of a lot lower money costs, but higher upfront sweat equity, right? So you're digging, you're maybe planting, you're maybe installing rock. These aren't hugely expensive things to do, but are things that can require a lot of labor. But it's great if you're trying to DIY and do things on your own. This is a great place to start. Now, I always say that it's not just a place to start, it is the foundation if you want to implement active rainwater harvesting. So I really, there's very rare circumstances where I would recommend having an active system without having thought through your passive system. And one of the reasons is that your passive system is how you manage stormwater on your site. So if you're not doing it actively, it's happening on your site. It's just happening and doing whatever it's going to do. Like the water is just going to flow. Versus being thoughtful about how you want that water to move through your landscape. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but when you have an active system, so say you have a tank or cistern, you're going to have an overflow from that tank, and that water has to go somewhere as well. And if you can use that as a resource and incorporate it into your passive rainwater harvesting system, then it's like you're already set. So a lot of times I like to kind of recommend starting with passive and then moving into the active, and you can phase it that way, because if you want to balance out the costs a little bit, that's a great way to go about it. The other difference to know when you're installing a passive system is that the water is used right away. So the water is getting collected and infiltrated into the ground right away. You're not storing it for future use. So that can be one of the cons of a passive system, is if you need to use that water throughout the year, say to water citrus or something like that, it's not going to be as helpful. All right. So our active systems are kind of the opposite of that, right? It involves more infrastructure. It's a little bit more complex to install, requires a little bit more maintenance. The other thing I like to say too is it requires a little bit more active participation from you as the homeowner, because right now there isn't a huge community of plumbers and installers who know how to maintain and operate these systems. So if you are going to install one, you kind of have to take on some of that responsibility yourself, and know how to manage and maintain that system. But like I was saying, if you're going to plant things that need water throughout the year, that needs to be distributed throughout the year, looking at a tank makes a lot of sense, because you can collect water from multiple storm events and distribute it throughout the year. The other circumstance I really like using active systems is if you have a lot of hardscape, or if you have a lot of concrete in your landscape, it can be very expensive to remove that. And you can't really harvest water if it's covered in concrete, right? So if you have a situation like that, tanks can sometimes be a really good solution, because you can actually collect that water and still make use of it, even though you can't put it directly in the landscape. So I just want to show this example. So I think this, you probably see this as a pretty, basic, simple landscape or average landscape, but this is actually a passive rainwater harvesting system. So this is just slightly graded so that all the landscape drains towards the middle. So it actually is the whole landscape area here is a large basin. And so they've done lots of planting in here, but all of the roof drains from the building adjacent to this let out into this landscape area. And just by doing that simple sloping to the grade, they're collecting all of that stormwater and using it as supplemental irrigation. So it doesn't have to be something that is super intricate or complicated. It can be just simple, just the way that you pitch the grade in your yard. It makes a difference. So I will go through, okay, I was gonna say. So there are some structures that we would call them, maybe like interventions, that would be really common to see in passive rainwater harvesting systems. I kind of like to talk about them in terms of their function, like what they do, why you would use them. So some of the features you'll commonly see in a passive system include swales. Swales are really great for conveyance, meaning that they are really great for moving water from one place to another. So often you might see a swale at the bottom of a downspout that directs water into a basin. A swale, is like kind of just like a little ditch, right? So it's a ditch or like a wash. And so it just kind of slopes towards the center, and then water moves down that down the grade. You can kind of see how that's working here. There's actually an equalizer pipe here. So once the water kind of makes its way through here and fills up, then it spills over into the next basin. All right, and then basins are the other big common component we'll see. And so, a really simple way to describe a basin is a hole in the ground. So that's what it is. We're creating some kind of indentation or impression in the landscape so that water can collect there, stays put, and then has time to infiltrate. So one of the things that we're doing, from a big picture perspective with rainwater harvesting systems is that we're kind of changing our focus from moving stormwater away from your landscape as quickly as possible, getting it into the curb and gutter, getting it to go down the storm drain, getting it out of the way. That's kind of where we want to move away from, and we want to move towards a strategy that lets us slow, spread, and sink. So we want to slow the water down in the landscape because that gives us more time and opportunity for it to infiltrate. We want to spread it out as much as possible because that reduces risk and allows us to distribute that water to all the plants that are in your landscape. And we want it to infiltrate. We want it to actually get into the soil because that's where plants use it, right? So that's kind of the direction we're heading and kind of the foundation or background you might take into your design process. Another common feature that you'll see is a berm. So this is kind of like, just building a dam or building, some kind of raised edge to collect water. The nice thing about berms is that they can kind of be used as conveyance and they can kind of be used as infiltration. So in this example with this little horseshoe shape, a lot of times what you'll see people do is that water builds up back behind there. And then as it builds up, there's a swale that kind of takes it around one side or the other. And that way you can allow it to stop, infiltrate, hold up a little bit of water, but then it can make its way around the corner and move into another feature. So it kind of does a little bit of double duty. That's actually what's happening in this example here. There's a kind of berm on this side. It has a spillway, and then it spills over into this next berm. And it spills over this edge and then comes along down out that way. So these are really nice because they can create really dynamic shapes and spaces in the landscape. The other nice thing about berms is that you can kind of get double duty out of your excavation. So if you excavate, say you were to excavate this area, dig this out, you can flip that soil over and use it to make your berm. So say you needed, a berm that's, say you needed a berm that was 8 inches high. If you're digging out 4 inches and then putting 4 inches on top, you're getting 8 inches of berm with less work. You're not bringing soil in. So that's another nice thing. You may be able also to combine the berm so that the berm becomes a pathway through your landscape. So that's another nice way to kind of balance and offset all the excavating you might be doing. Oops, sorry. Oh, that's on a animation. There's a lot of manuals out there. These graphics come from the city of Tucson has a rainwater harvesting manual resource, which is really nice as well. It is online, yeah. Yeah, if you just search City of Tucson Rainwater Harvesting, they actually have a couple. So they have kind of like a short version. This is from the longer version. So it's a little complex, but it's still a good read. But anyway, it has a lot of different examples. All of these different manipulations of the landscape are different ways to harvest water. There's like a million different ideas out there, and there's tons of ways to do it. I'll also say, especially if you have a larger property, like acre or more, this book, which is Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond, this is volume 2. This book specifically addresses earthworks. So if you're looking for some strategies that might be, yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to leave them up here so you can flip through them, when the presentation's over. But this one's really great in terms of earthworks because it has tons of ideas and more in-depth explanation of how to use all those different earthworks. So I highly recommend that one. Okay, let's see. All right, so this is kind of a diagram to like string all these elements together. And I'm sorry, yeah, okay. We're gonna go back. I skipped a slide. So I was like, where is this one? So I wanted to give you just a kind of really basic kind of diagram of how these passive system works. Like what is it all, what does it all entail? So this is a really kind of the most basic way to look at it. So number one, the first part of the system is going to be your roof or catchment area. This is the area where you're going to catch water and collect it from. You can also do that from your landscape, but we always start at the top of the watershed, the highest point in your yard, and that's usually your house. The next part is going to be conveyance. So in this example, it's gutters. They have a gutter along this side of their roof, and that's going to move your water into your system. So somehow the water you're collecting has to get into the system that you're designing. The third part is the basin. So this would be your earthworks. These are the modifications that you're making to harvest that water in whatever way you want to do it. In this case, they just built a simple, it's not really even a base, they've built a berm around that just holds that water in place. And then the fourth part are the plants. This is storage. This is increasing the water holding capacity of your landscape. Plants are a huge part of that. We really want to have as much vegetation associated with your basins and your water harvesting features as possible because they also hold and absorb water, right? And so that improves your water holding capacity over time. We also want to implement as much organic matter in these features as possible. So that might mean utilizing wood chips or some kind of organic mulch that can also add and improve water holding capacity. But when you're using a passive system, you have to imagine your soil is your rainwater harvesting tank, right? And so you're harvesting as much water as your soil will let you. There's some things about your soil you can't really change, but there's some things you can do. And so as much as you can to improve how much water gets stored in your soil, the more water holding capacity you're gonna have. Okay, I thought that was important. I just wanted to go back to that. Okay, and then this is another example. So this is actually from Watershed Management Group. They're a nonprofit down in Tucson. And I did my rainwater harvesting training certification through them. But this is kind of a more in-depth, kind of more detailed look of how these elements might string together. So again, they have a downspout, right? So they have a downspout that takes water from their roof into the landscape. In this example, they've got a swale taking the water to a basin. So they've actually rock lined part of that swale. Lining your swale or parts of your rainwater harvesting features with rock is not an absolute necessity, but it is really not convenient. It is really important in areas where you suspect you might have issues with erosion or issues with soil washing away. So anywhere there's kind of like a lot of velocity or movement to the water, you might look at using rock just to armor that soil, keep it in place. So in this example, they have a rock armored overflow. This is where the water overflows from the swale into the basin. So it's got a little bit more velocity because there's a drop in elevation there. And so they've rock lined that. And then in this example, so they're actually showing an implementation of heavy organic mulch in this basin. So I don't want you to look at this section and think that they've excavated all that soil and then brought new soil in. What they are doing is just applying organic mulch in that basin. So even a layer of 2 to 4 inches, kind of at a minimum, helps keep moisture in the soil, reduces evaporation. It improves soil health because all of that organic matter gets broken down and recycled into the soil, and also helps reduce erosion as well. You'll also see that plants feature really heavily in this design. So there's a lot of grass planted in this system. Grass is a really important component because all grasses have very fibrous root systems. So they're really great at holding soil in place and helping reduce erosion. The other reason I really love grasses is because they can get inundated, right? So if this fills up with water and it's holding water for a little bit, the Grasses don't mind that. They can tolerate some water standing on their roots. Things that will not tolerate that include any of your cactus, agaves, succulents, anything like that. So those types of plants are a no-go for your basin in the bottom, but they could go just outside your basin, right? So their roots can still access that water. They can still get moisture. They just can't sit in it or they will rot. The other thing you'll notice in this example is that the tree is kind of like planted on a terrace. This is something you'll see sometimes recommended. I don't always recommend it, but one of the reasons that we plant trees, one of the reasons you would plant a tree on a terrace like this so it's not in the bottom of your basin, is that sometimes trees do also have trouble with water sitting up against the trunk. If you've ever kind of drawn a really simple picture of a tree, you probably do like 2 straight lines and then it has that little flare at the bottom. We call it the trunk flare. And so if that area gets covered with mulch and there's a lot of water being held up against it, trees can really struggle with that, depending on the variety. So especially if you're using a lot of organic matter in your basins, it's not a terrible idea to either plant your tree a little bit higher or plant it just on the outside of your basin. Trees, the roots will extend out to the edge of the canopy. So if you draw an imaginary line from the edge of the canopy down to the ground, that's where the roots will extend to. So as long as those roots, as long as you plant it so that the eventual large size of the tree overlaps with the basin, they'll be able to get access to that water. Okay, anything else I want to cover from here? The other thing I want to say too is, most of my examples have shown a downspout or gutters of some type. If you're doing a passive system, gutters are not necessarily an absolute thing that you have to install. You can allow water to just fall off of your roof, and you would just use some different strategies to collect it, because the benefit of the downspout is it's all coming to one specific point, so you just pick it up there and take it to where you need it. But if you didn't have gutters, you would just plan to collect it all along that length of roof or whatever that section is. So it's not an absolute necessity, but is really gives you more design flexibility. Just some more examples of passive rainwater harvesting systems. This is again, this is just kind of a shallow. This is actually some kind of like a combination basin swale. And in this example, they actually are taking stormwater from the street. So they do have curb cuts that bring that stormwater in. But this landscape is completely watered on rainwater. They don't provide any irrigation any longer. So they did provide some irrigation to establish it. And in fact, at this site, they watered by hand. So they didn't even install a drip irrigation system initially. And now they don't provide any supplemental water at all. Here's another example of a passive system. So again, they've got a section of gutter here and a downspout. They rock lined that there, right? Because there's a lot of velocity coming out of that downspout. And then it gets directed just into this shallow basin here. That's the extent of it there. And you'll see, like, that's not a hugely deep, depression, right? This one's probably 6 to 8 inches, something like that. So it doesn't have to be that big, that deep necessarily when you're looking at doing these passive systems. We'll talk a little bit about how you do those calculations, but you can actually harvest a lot of water. You can harvest most of the water that's going to fall on your roof, especially in your landscape, pretty easily. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about active rainwater harvesting. So I introduced it, right? So this is when we start incorporating tanks and cisterns. Like I said, it works in concert with your passive systems. So try to think of it as start with passive and then add on your active. And I think mostly what I want to say about this is when I'm doing consultations and talking to people about how they might, I help people develop a strategy, right, for harvesting rainwater in their site. And the way I approach tanks is that I'm always thinking about the trade-off between, the cost and the maintenance and the infrastructure that you've got to maintain, and what are you using it for, right? So I really want those things to balance out, because if your plan is to have a really low maintenance landscape with lots of native plants, I don't know that a tank is necessarily the way that I would direct you to go. It's a lot of cost, a lot of upkeep, and you don't really need that much water, right? Like if you're using native landscaping, because those plants are adapted to our natural rainfall patterns. You're going to be augmenting that, supplementing it with your rainwater harvesting. So a tank might, in that scenario, be overkill. So I always like to think about that. But like I said, if you are looking at having citrus or fruit trees or things that require water throughout the year when we're not going to have rain, then it might make a lot more sense, and or like I said, if you have a lot of hardscape, those are some other circumstances that make sense. But I always just encourage you to kind of think about that trade-off and think of it as, hey, this is a higher investment thing. Am I really getting the payoff for it? All right. So again, common elements of an active system. So this is a really simple example. All right, so unlike with passive systems, if you have an active system, some kind of gutter is pretty much a necessity, because you've got a small place you're trying to get that water to, and you need to direct it. So first component is the roof, right? Second component are the gutters. So these gutters, there's two sections, and they both drain to this column. You will see that, so a lot of what I'm recommending are best management practices. There's a range of ways you can install a tank. And Phil, maybe, hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that too. But I'm just kind of suggesting some things that I know of as best management practices, best ways for install. So you do want to have some kind of initial filtration. This is a, I'm going to forget the name of it, but it's like a leaf head filter or something along those lines. Leaf diverter. Thank you. I'm having like brain fog today, so some of my words are not here. So anyway, but this is kind of like a first initial, like, get the big stuff out of the way for you filtration. So it's sloped like that, so you can just brush the leaves off, right, so they don't build up this huge backflow there that you've got to clean up. And then from that point is the inflow into the tank. So however you pipe that and want that to be installed, that's your next step. Then we've got the tank itself. So this is a plastic polypropylene tank. And in every tank, you will have an overflow. Now, your passive systems should all have an overflow too. But it is essential when you have a tank, because it's only got a certain amount of volume, and once it fills up, that water is going to go somewhere, and you want it to go somewhere not bad, right? You want it to go somewhere you've planned for. And so in this instance, this is just a landscape area. So there's actually a little swale that leads out to a kind of bunch of fruit trees. So we just installed this one with a PVC pipe that just outlets into that swale. There's different ways that you can install those, but the gist of it is it needs to go somewhere. Then you'll have your distribution. So you can't see it on this tank, but you can actually see it on the tanks Phil brought out there. So just some kind of hose bib or valve that you're going to use to get that water out of the tank. And then your foundation. So you're going to have a foundation, something for that tank to sit on. Yeah.
Is in this kind of a situation, is planning for the overflow really necessary? Because if you didn't have a tank, all that water would flow to where it's going to go anyway.
Well, yes, but once you put this intervention, now you've put an intervention in, right? If you put the tank in. So that water is going to keep going into your tank, or it's just going to flow over through your inflow, right? It's going to kind of flow out of your inflow. So it has to go somewhere, and you need to plan for where it's going to go. It can go exactly where it was before, but you just need to know, because you can imagine, like, if I turned this tank around.
You have to have an overflow, but you don't necessarily have to engineer where it's.
Correct. You have to know where it's going to go, but you don't necessarily have to install a swale and make sure it goes through, but you want to know where it goes, because if I turned it and faced it to my house, then all that water is going onto my patio now. So, you just got to make sure you know where that water's going. The thing I wanted to say about the foundation is, this can be relatively simple. The things that you want to use for a foundation, we've just used a couple inches of bedding sand here. Your foundation needs to be level, and it needs to be smooth, because the weight of the water in a tank will create a lot of pressure. So if you have rocks or debris or things under there, they're just poking on that little bit bottom of the tank, those can be a problem in the long run. So you don't necessarily have to pour a concrete pad, but you do need something that you can make level and something that will be smooth and not abrasive to the tank. This is an example of kind of, full-blown, blown-out system of an active install. So you'll see the tank there. This is their overflow. So this is what's coming out the side here. And they just have it directing into this basin here. So whenever that water overflows that tank, they've captured as much as they can. Then it just flows throughout their passive system, right? They're just using their basins. So that's a great way to think about it. You have to think about if you like this type of install, right? This is just on the ground. So, it could be a trip hazard or something like that. Your pipe is exposed. There's different ways to tackle that overflow install. And I have some pictures, so we'll talk about that too. There's different tank material, right? So there's different options and choices for what your tank is made from. What's really common I see now are the plastic tanks, these polypropylene tanks. They're pretty, they create a nice balance between affordability and durability, and ease of install. But this is kind of like when you're in official rainwater tank cistern territory. So this is like, the big guns. It's kind of that bigger one that's out there in the hall. This one here you can't see too well, but this is just a 55-gallon drum, like the one that's going to be raffled tonight. And so this is kind of like tank territory. It's kind of a great place to start, because you learn how to plumb everything, you learn how to use the water. But it's not usually as big of a financial investment to start with that small tank. You will find that it fills up quickly, and the water doesn't go. It's like when you put a 5-gallon bucket out to like harvest a little bit of water, and you're like, oh, that filled up fast. So that'll happen with those too. But sometimes it's just the right thing for that amount of space, and it can be a great solution or a great place to start. Maybe you just want to use it to add some water to some potted plants or something like that. So it can be a good solution. These metal culvert tanks are kind of not quite as popular at the moment. They can provide a really nice aesthetic. Most of these installs that you'll see are probably custom installs, so it involves a little bit more construction experience and know how to install them. There are some manufacturers that do like a pre-manufactured tank in metal. I haven't had the chance to use one on a project. I believe they're pretty expensive though. So keep that in mind. Let's see. All right, so one of the things to know about tanks is that there's kind of two different ways that a tank can be installed, two general ways they can be installed, and we call that wet install and dry install. A dry install is when the inlet pipes, a wet install is when the inlet pipes to your tank run underground before going into the tank. So they get sent underground, you direct it to wherever you'd like, it pops back up and into your tank. The convenient thing about this is that it makes locating your tank really flexible. So you can actually run that pipe for quite a ways and still be able to collect that water. So it's really nice in terms of design. The install's a little bit more complex, and especially if you're like in a hard freeze area, there's a little bit more maintenance. You want to make sure you have something that you can use to drain those pipes, because the caveat here is that those pipes always will have some water in them. That's why it's called wet install. Dry install is when your inlet tanks go directly into your tank. So it's a much simpler installation, but you have a lot less flexibility of where you locate that tank, because it kind of has to, spit out directly into your tank. I have some pictures here which are more helpful. All right, so this is a dry system. So you'll see just really, really basic kind of stick figure. These are the gutters here, and so they've got a supply pipe that comes across and directly into the top of the tank. That's a dry install. Once all of this water flows into the tank, there's nothing left in the pipe because it's all gravity fed right into the tank.
What are the first flush devices?
So I think I do have a slide talking about first flush devices. These are kind of an optional best management practice for filtration. It kind of depends on who you talk to. Some people think they're optional, some people don't. I find if you are planning to run that water through some kind of irrigation system, you really want to look at implementing a first flush device. Or if you know that you're going to have a lot of debris and things like that on your roof, that's also another good reason to install a first flush. Okay, so wet systems. So you can see this a little bit better in the graphic than me just explaining it. In this example, so they've got a rain head filter, and then this is their inflow pipe. So it comes directly down from the gutters there, runs underground, and then pops up again and then into the tank. So what happens here, one of the characteristics of water is that it always, in a container, water always finds level. So in this example, your pipes are part of your container, part of your tank. So they'll level out, the water in the pipes will level out at the same height the water is in your tank. So you just have to kind of think about it at that process. I mean, if there's not that much water in, it's going to be lower, but there's always going to be some water in the system.
Do you need a pump for that system?
No, so you're just using force from the storm itself and from gravity. That's what's feeding this into. There are some, constraints you kind of want to work within, and some dimensions to think about. For example, like where the height of your rain head is, where that is, and I'll talk about that. But you don't need to use a pump to get it into the tank.
Question for
Yeah.
mosquitoes. How do you keep them out of, especially systems?
Yeah.
They can get into your pipes, they can get into your tank.
Right. So in
Something
all.
you're going to address later.
Yes, but let me go back here. So there's a couple of things you want to do. So you want to prevent the mosquitoes from getting in, right? So that's the main thing here. And so at any inflow point or any point where a mosquito can just fly its little way in there, you want to have a mosquito grade screen on that tank. So in this example, the filter head has a mosquito-proof screen to it. I also have mine going into a strainer basket that has a mosquito-grade screen, and then my overflow here also has a mosquito-grade screen. So a lot of these, like especially if you buy these like Bushman tanks and some of these tanks that are manufactured, they have those components built in, and so you don't have to like figure out how to like where do you find all this stuff, right? But that's the main thing. You want to prevent those mosquitoes from even getting into the tank at all.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is the part, well, okay, the part is coming up where you guys got to hang in with it, because we're going to do a little bit of math because I want you guys to, oh yes, so he's holding up the mosquito strainer basket behind you, just so you can see, you can take a look and see how fine that is. So it's usually kind of a specialty thing, so it either needs to come with your tank or you know somebody who can put it on a tank. Okay.
Do they get heavy
changed out?
What's that?
Is it part of maintenance? Like how
Yes.
do they need to be changed out?
They don't need to be changed. They're metal, so they're durable, but they do need to be cleaned.
Right.
You know, so it depends on how much it's raining and all that stuff. So, but at least before each rainy season, right? So before monsoon and before our winter rains.
Excuse me,
Yes.
what about a screen for the barrels?
So I think that example that you held up, is on the barrel. So the barrels, to my knowledge, you kind of have to get them custom made, or you kind of have to do it. So the tanks are nice because they kind of come manufactured with those items. The barrels like that, you kind of have to do it yourself a little bit. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna talk about how to actually implement this in your project. So I want you guys to have at least some tools to start the basic process of, how do I actually implement this? Like, all these ideas are great, but I've got to like put it in practice, right? So one of the things that I encourage you guys to think about is that rainwater harvesting is not just one thing that you do in your yard or your project. It is part of an integrated design process. We really want to be thinking about the whole picture. You want your rainwater harvesting systems to work with everything else that you're doing in your yard. You don't want it to be a standalone thing. And so these principles I find really helpful for creating that nice framework. Again, they're from the Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond. This is the volume 1. I've got a copy here you can flip through, but you can look. Like, it's not a huge book. It's very approachable. Brad Lancaster, who's the author, lives in Tucson. So it's really very applicable to our region, and he's a hoot. So it's a really easy, fun read. But some of the things that you want to think about, and these are the principles that he, recommends, which is begin with long and thoughtful observation. So all of this process takes the amount of time it takes. And the longer that you observe your landscape, the longer that you see it in practice, the longer you're living in it, the more information you're going to have to inform your design process. So sometimes people, tell me like, oh, well, we've lived here for so long and we haven't done anything. And I always tell them, you're just doing long, thoughtful observation. You're just on step 1, right? So that's okay. It can take as much time as you want because you want to live through the space in different parts of the year. That's actually really important because you'll see where you have flooding problems, where you have a lot of shade, where you don't have a lot of shade, if that changes, in the summer versus the winter because the angle of the sun changes. So all that's really valuable information. The second is to start at the top of your watershed. So for us, usually that's roof. But the guiding principle behind this is that the higher up in the watershed you start, the higher up, elevation in your landscape that you start, the less time the water has to create a problem. So the earlier you can intervene, the less time that water has to accumulate, to form rills and create erosion in the landscape. So we want to intervene as early as possible. So we're always thinking about that top part of the watershed. Again, we want to start small and simple. That's one of the reasons I like passive rainwater harvesting, because that is starting small and simple. You don't have to feel like you need to go full bore and have a tank and be running your house on rainwater from step 1. You can start small and learn along the way how to implement some of these strategies. We want to slow spread and infiltrate water. Plan for an overflow, so we always have a plan for where that overflow is going to go. And we want to maximize organic and living ground cover, so we talked a little bit about that, incorporating plants and organic mulch. And then stacking functions. So this is one where I'm kind of really emphasizing that this is part of an integrated design process. You want to think about how your rainwater harvesting systems can have more than one impact in your yard, right? So can your tank be a screen if you have, a view, to a neighbor or something that you don't want to see? Or Can you actually plant plants that view the screen, or create a screen for your tank instead, and they're watered with the overflow from it. It's just thinking about all those components and how they can be integrated together. And then 8 kind of like loops back to 1, but it's continually reassess your system. You're kind of a little scientist, right, of this project. And so you want to be observing it, seeing if it's working, checking to make sure some berm doesn't blow out, or it actually gets really exciting when you've installed something like this and you can go out and like, is it working the way like I thought it was going to work? And you get to see all of that. So and landscapes are living systems. They're not a building that you plop there and it's done. They're alive. So you're always going to be involved in that process of creation. All right. So your first step is going to be creating a site plan. There's a couple different ways to do this. It kind of depends on what you'd like to do. I highly recommend getting some aerial imagery, and there's a couple of places that I recommend. Now, we're not in Maricopa County right now, but you might be in Maricopa County. But your assessor will also have some resources. I haven't used Pinal County's website recently, so I don't know. Have you used? Yeah.
They have the assessor's map.
Yeah. So your county will have access to aerial imagery. So you can visit that website and use. They usually have a GIS interface that allows you to print that imagery, and they usually fly the images more frequently, so they're more updated. Another option is to use Google Earth Pro. So this is actually a program that you download, not just through the internet browser. But this is a really great resource. It's free to download, the basic version, and you can print maps, and it also has lots of tools like rulers and things like that, so you can actually get dimensions and things like that that are pretty useful. And then you can also, just go old-fashioned and get out a measuring tape and some graph paper and put it together by hand. So those are all options. But when you start your site plan, you want to start compiling the basics. So the basic kind of where your start is up here. You want to have the property line. You want to know where that is. Your house. Any other permanent structures, pool, walkways, shed, anything that's staying you want to identify. Existing plants, especially existing plants you want to keep. And then orientation. We always need to know north, south, east, west. So those are the basics. That's where you start with. And then we can layer different information on top of that. So you always want to try and identify utility information. Before you dig, you should call Arizona 811. So this is a service that locates public utilities that may be on your property, so you'll know where they are before you dig and have an issue. They don't mark private utilities, so they won't mark your private service line from the public line to your house. A lot of times you can figure that out because you'll know where your water service to your house is. But you can also get private utility locating services. It's important because not only do you not want to dig, and damage utilities, but you don't want to necessarily plant a tree right on top of your water line. So those are things just to keep in mind for your design process. You're going to want to look at sun, how it impacts your site, how it flows across your site, and then keep in mind that the sun travels on your site differently throughout the year. So where it is in the winter is different than where it is in the summer. You want to think about water and how that moves through your site. So your storm water, you want to observe how it flows off your roof and how it flows in your landscape. You're going to be looking for things like, if you have a concrete patio, does it drain away from your house like it's supposed to, or does it drain towards your house and create a problem? So those are all kinds of things you want to identify. Any practical concerns that you have, like, I need to have space to move my trash bins and things like that. Any kind of cultural things, do you like to garden? Do you need to screen some noisy neighbors? Things like that. And then, any aesthetic, things that you care about. If there's a view that you want to make sure you don't block. These are all things that you identify to help inform your design process. So you can layer all this stuff together in these really cool site analysis diagrams. So this is that previous example, kind of all layered on top of each other. This is an example from the Xeriscape manual that I've got a copy of up here. This is also a pretty good reference, and they've digitized it on the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association website. So you can use that as well. But this one's really simple, right? It's just kind of circles. So that's an easy way to do it. The book from Brad Lancaster, he's got a really fun version of his where he's like, oh, I want to be able to like wave at neighbors that are walking down the street. All that kind of stuff can be part of your landscape. Okay, so really basic math, but we're going to just start so you have the concept, okay? All right. So where do we go from here? We now have our basic site plan information, how we want to put together the design, but how do we size our features? How do we determine how big these things are supposed to be? How do we know how much water we're collecting? All that kind of stuff, right? So there's a couple of ways that you can approach sizing the features. One is to size the features based on water supply, right? Like you calculate how much water you're going to get from the roof, and you size your water harvesting feature based on that. The second would be to size your features based on demand. How much water do your plants need? And then you size your basin so that you provide that much water. And then another option would be to size your features based on your soil percolation rate. So you'd actually do a percolation test, discover how long it takes for your water to infiltrate, and design your basins so that they infiltrate in a recommended time frame. So you asked about mosquitoes. We also want to make sure that our basins drain in 36 hours to prevent mosquito breeding as well. So that's another way to size those basins. Now I'll kind of give you my input. So this last one, I will only do that if I know that there's drainage issues. So observe your site and just be aware if you have drainage issues. Do you see standing water? Do you see moss, kind of growing in certain areas? Those are all indications that you might have drainage issues. And then if you do, then I would do the perk test and figure out if you need to size your basins based on that. I don't often start with sizing features based on water demand because I don't often have a landscape plan before I start. So, it's kind of hard to put the cart before the horse. So usually I start by sizing my features with water demand. So I figure out how much rainwater I'm going to have, and that's how I determine my basin size. So this is the equation. Your handout has this equation and all the necessary information on it as well. So you can use that as a reference if you get further down this track. But to calculate water supply, you use your catchment area in square feet. You multiply that by a runoff coefficient. You multiply that by 0.623, and then you multiply that by rainfall in inches. We'll kind of go through each one of these. So your catchment area is the area from which you are collecting water. So it can be that simple. We're calling this roof area would be your catchment area. That's where you're collecting the water from. So what you need to know is that area in square feet. So you just need to know the length and the width in square feet for your catchment area. So it can be, part of this process is figuring out where your roof slopes, right? So you need to know where your sub-watersheds of this roof are. And so you would look at your ridge lines. So in this example, all these blue arrows are the directions that water is flowing. And then all these dotted lines are are where we would install gutters. So that's where water could be collected. And so we divide that roof area into sub-watersheds because functionally we're going to be able to collect water in those locations. So we've divided it up into a couple of different sections. All right, then your runoff coefficient. So this is a coefficient. It's a number that comes from a chart, from a table. And basically what this number represents is how much water is lost or absorbed by the catchment surface. So how much water gets absorbed by your roof. For most of us, this is going to be a pretty low number, meaning that that not a lot of water is going to get absorbed by the roof. So you'll see values ranging from, kind of 0.9 to 0.95, depending on the material.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So when you're measuring the collection as a roof,
Mm-hmm.
is it basically the dimensions of the floor? Because I calculated,
Yes.
assuming that it was the two sides of the roof.
Nope.
That's
You
not
just
the-
like
the-
like you're looking at it, bird's eye. You're counting that footprint.
So
you don't need
I
to calculate.
overestimated then.
Yes. Yep. You don't need it. So what she's asking is, how do you do that? Because if you just calculate, if you calculated that roof on the angle, you'd get a larger square footage. So you're just looking at it from the bird's eye view.
And you can use the measuring features on
Yep,
Google
on
Earth.
Google Earth or on the assessor's website. That's an easy way to do it, yeah. Okay, and then 0.623, this is a constant. So this is a number that basically converts your calculation from volume to gallons, because gallons is what's relevant to us. And so what's important to know is if you're using this equation, if you're using that constant, when you calculate rainfall, you need to do it in inches. So if you calculate your rainfall in feet, you need to use a different coefficient with this equation. So just keep that in mind. Both equations are on the worksheet, so don't worry about that. All right, so then the tricky part is rain. So how much rain are we calculating? Like, where do we get that number from, right? And so this does take a lot of discretion. It's kind of up to you as the designer. What I recommend is to always start by calculating a 1-inch storm event and then calculating the annual precipitation. Most of our storms, a majority of storms in the year are going to be 1 inch or less. And so if you can calculate that 1-inch storm event and you can capture that, you're going to capture a lot of the storm events throughout the year. That's why I start there. And then I also calculate the annual precipitation, because if I'm going to use that water in a tank or something like that, I want to know throughout the year what's the number I'm looking at. And then what's important with this rainfall information is the more specific you can get rainfall data to your site, the better, because even across the valley, it really can vary, depending especially on your elevation. So this is data from the Maricopa County Flood Control District. I'm sure Pinal County also has similar data as well. But you can see I can actually get, for the last 30 years of data recording, that was the actual measured rainfall at that location. So you can kind of find a weather station that's close to you, and if they have a nice chart like that, you can get actual on the ground specific data.
What websites then?
So you would, depending on your county, you would either look for the Pinal County Flood Control District or the Maricopa County Flood Control District. Another resource is AZMET, AZMET, and I don't know if they go into they might go into Pinal County too.
They do.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So that's another resource as well.
Does SRP have, because they measure so much.
I don't know if they have it like publicly accessible. Yeah. I haven't tried. Okay. So basically what we're going to do is then run through all those calculations for each roof area. And then you get a total. So, in a 1-inch storm event, on this house, you're getting about 2,000 gallons of water collected from that roof. In an annual, so in a year, we're looking at about 8,000 gallons. So, these are usable numbers, right? These are really helpful. And then, as a rule of thumb, if you want to do something quick, in a 1-inch storm event, you can collect about 600 gallons per 1,000 square foot of roof. So that's just a real, off the cuff kind of way to do it. All right, so once you know how much volume you've got, then you have to actually size the basins. It's kind of just one step further. But some things that you'll need to know, you're going to have to assume a certain depth for your basin, like how deep do you want that basin to be. My preferred range is 6 to 10 inches. And no more than 18 inches, and I really don't like to go more than 12. This process will be iterative, so you're going to kind of calculate your water supply, size some basins, kind of like go back and forth until you get like, this is the size I can have, and this is how much space I have. But basically what you're going to do is use the same equation, but you're going to like work it backwards. So you already know the volume that you want. You calculated how much that volume is. So you plug in what depth you want for your basin, and it'll spit out, well, you'll spit out your basin area, how big that basin needs to be in order to capture that much volume. Now, sizing tanks is a little bit different because with a tank, you're going to collect water over multiple storm events. And you're also, you're more constrained by the tank sizes that are available, by how much space you have to install that tank, by the kind of constraints of your roof layout. And so what you're going to kind of do is kind of do this process, this kind of iterative process too, of kind of figuring out the sweet spot between all of those things. Now, one good starting point for figuring out a tank is to try and collect half of the year's rainfall. Sometimes this is accomplishable and sometimes it is not. But the reason I suggest it as a starting point is because our rainy seasons are kind of we're bi-seasonal, right? So we have a wet summer and a wet winter. So if you can kind of collect the summer water and use that until we get rains in the winter, it kind of makes a nice logistical way to start. So it's just a starting point, and you can see that 4 inches at this example home, this is a huge tank, and we're not even getting a full capacity to do that. So, well, that's looking like it's not really likely. So then you can kind of run down the list and figure out which sizes really make more sense for your project. Okay. Okay, so just some other factors. I'm going to kind of try and go through these quickly, but these are just a lot of things I think I've covered already. So we'll just keep going. Okay, tanks. So one of the things that's important, you kind of alluded to, like, do you need a pump, is head pressure. So in order to get this water to flush through all these pipes and back into your tank, you need to have a certain amount of drop between the bottom of your filter and the top of your tank. And so maybe you might be able to like add a little bit to this, but like 12 to 18 inches is kind of a minimum that you need to push that water through. And this can be kind of tricky, especially if you have like an older ranch style houses. We kind of have those low profile roofs, and so that can really constrain the size of tank that's useful to you. So it's something to really be to have at the top of your mind, because it will affect what tank options are available to you. I talked about this a little bit. There's different material types. There's different tank sizes and dimensions. So this is what they call a slimline tank. So it's really great for fitting in narrow spaces. This is a culvert tank, so this is kind of a custom install. But just to know that there's different material options out there. So some maintenance things and kind of general concerns for tanks. You want to keep your tank watertight, right? So checking for leaks and that kind of thing. You want to keep it mosquito proof, right? So we talked about those screens that keep the mosquitoes out. You want to make sure your tank is light proof. So you want to make sure light can't get in, because that's what will promote algae growth. So that's an important thing. These plastic tanks are solid, so light doesn't get in them. All right, and then doing occasional, keeping your gutters clear, cleaning off your filter. If you have a basket, like you'll see on the ones out there, you'll have to clean those out occasionally too, because that'll impact the flow of water, and you just want to make sure that that's all working properly. This first flush device, which we talked about a little bit, basically what this does is it allows the water to come into this section of pipe. And then once it fills up, it spills over, and this pipe is the one that goes to your cistern. So what that does is it kind of captures the first bit of the storm that's got all the gunk, where it's washing off the bird poop and the this and the dirt and all that stuff. And so you collect it here before you put it into your tank. So it's just a nice best management practice for keeping that water clean.
You say collect it, it's just going to flow off, right?
Yeah, no, it's got a screw cap at the end, so it'll collect, and you have to manually open that up.
Is that what you had labeled as like a first
First flush.
Okay, that
Yep.
makes great sense.
Yep.
At what point does the roof shingles tend to stop being, well, starts being useful, stops being toxic?
That's a great question. I don't know that I have a good answer for you. I would say that we generally consider in the like suite of waters that you can harvest, roof water is one of the cleanest that you can rainwater is one of the cleanest. So, a metal roof is like the ideal roof, but they're very expensive, right? So I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by toxic and what your concern is by the toxicity, like how you're using the water, what the end use of the water is. If you're using it for irrigation of just about anything, you're probably fine. If you're drinking it, which I'm not recommending, I'm on record, I'm not recommending, different story. Okay, so overflow, we talked about this simple overflow option. But you can also direct your overflow other places in your yard. So they have these great little pop-up valves, and they operate with water pressure again. So when water's flowing through it, it pops up. When there's no pressure, it pops down, which keeps it mosquito-proof. And you can connect these to your downspout so that you can run that you can connect them to your downspout or your tank overflow so that you can direct that water where you'd like it to go.
What is that cap called on the end of there? What do you call that?
A pop-up valve. You'll see them like even if you just go to Home Depot, they have like a stormwater aisle usually.
Stormwater pop-up valve?
Yep.
So that's a stormwater pipe, is that what it's called if I went to Home Depot?
So this is PVC. If you can actually use PVC, that's better. It's a more durable material. They also have a black pipe. ABS, yes, thank you. Which if you're not, if it's not, but that's not potable water rated, so, but is, stormwater. So as long as it's just going to your landscape, that's okay too. And sometimes you have to use the ABS because the pop-up valve doesn't necessarily fit on the Schedule 40. So you kind of gotta mess around with it a little bit and find your right plumbing connections. Yeah, go
There's
ahead.
a box between the bottom of the downspout and this stormwater pipe. What's happening?
Yeah, in this example, I think that's just a filter. So I think that they can open.
I need to filter it?
No.
No.
I don't know. This is not an example from
I just
our
wanna get it away
climate.
from the house before I leave this week, so
Yeah.
I wanna do something
I wouldn't. I would just, I would like
Okay.
let it because, that's another maintenance thing to stop you, or stop your water rather. So I talked about plants a little bit. Some of the plants that are ideal for different locations in your basins, so not using your cactus and succulents in the bottom of your basins, but look to use your grasses. The other thing is riparian species, so species that are native and adapted to riparian areas are great for bottoms of basins because typically they are used to excess water. And then we talked about location as well. We want to keep those outside at the bottom of basin. So there's a couple of resources, and I'll kind of flip back to this slide at the end, but there's a couple of resources here if you want to do some more plant research. And then we talked about mulch a little bit. So I talked about wood chip mulch. This is an organic mulch that breaks down and provides lots of benefits to the soil. But DG or rock mulch is also a great option. It's still going to provide that benefit of reducing water loss and preventing erosion. It's just not going to add as many benefits as wood chip mulch does. All right, so the one thing I want to say about critical elevations here is that you want to make sure when you're designing your basins and your systems is that this tank, or basin, when it fills up, you want to make sure it's not going back towards your house. So that's the critical elevation. You want to make sure that the overflow of your system is lower than the elevation of your house because you don't want it to fill up and then track back to your house, right? Like we don't want to create a problem that wasn't there. So it's just really critical to be aware of that and make sure that once you create your intervention, when it overflows, when it fills, that it's not going somewhere you don't want it to go. Okay. And yeah, so we've covered a lot today. It's really hard. It's a really big topic, so it's kind of hard to boil it down. So some other resources that you guys can look into. The Rainwater Harvesting for Landscape Use is a free publication from the Extension Service. So you do a little Googling and you can find that one. Watershed Management Group is a great resource. They have tons of information on their website, and they host classes and sometimes hands-on workshops up in the valley too. So you might just want.
Oh, the watershed?
Yep. You might want to get on their mailing list for the valley because they kind of will keep you updated if there's events. And then, like I said, this is kind of the #1 book I recommend. It's not super expensive, not hard to get through, and it's a great resource. Most of the libraries have it too, so you can check it out. So, yeah, but I'll kind of stop there so we can talk to Phil and you guys can ask questions and all that stuff.
Yeah, so while we transition really quickly, thank you, Kaylee, for going over that presentation.
Yeah.
We do have her card out on the back table. She has a company, 88 Acres, where she does consulting.
Yep, landscape consulting and design.
Landscape consulting and design. So if you want any of her help, please grab her card out there and you can ask her more questions, but we'll give it over to Phil. Is it okay if we run a few minutes over, Dave? Would that be okay? Okay, cool. So Phil's gonna go over some photos that he has from designs that he's done with active rainwater harvesting, so using the tanks, and then he'll talk a little bit about his services, the tanks in the back, and then we'll do the raffle, and then if you guys have any questions, you can stick around and ask questions. So, Phil Grant.
Hello, I'm Phil. I learned a lot there. Thank you. That's a lot of information to go over. So I don't know if you guys want to just do fire off questions or you want to go through my slides. There's a lot of information.
Do you want me to just flip through stuff?
Yeah, there's a lot of.
I have one burning question.
Okay.
Are you allowed to take rainwater out of a natural wash that runs through your property?
I don't know that question. I'm not gonna lie to you. I don't.
Okay, no.
I mean, I've backed the Sequoia Wash.
So I believe not. So that's taking water. It depends on like the grade of the wash. If it's an actual water course. Yeah. You'd have to look, but that's similar to taking stormwater out of the street, right? So you're taking it out of a natural conveyance. Does the wash run through your property?
My property, it's my land.
Well, then I have people that have had tanks.
Follow up on that question. Yeah, because it depends. Some washes are like actual water designated as water courses, and that would be different than. Yeah.
I was just gonna mention, I know for a wash,
Oh,
it
sure.
needs to enter and exit the same place on your property, but
Yeah.
without your property, you can choose where you want it to go. So I don't know
Yes.
why you couldn't set berms coming off of it whilst it's going through your property, depending on where it goes.
Yes, and that's kind of what I'm thinking. It just depends on how big the wash is and if it's part of like like an area drainage plan.
It's a natural wash.
Yeah. Yes, but that could still be designated part of your community's drainage plan. So that's what you would need to find out. Your flood control district would be a really good resource to consult for that.
And I've had lots of people put sump pumps in and pump them up to tanks and then use the water later.
That's what I want.
So, I mean, do what you want.
Yeah, which is a much better option than actually modifying how the wash functions is a little bit different than accessing the water from it.
Yeah,
Can you go through some of your products? So that
Sure. A lot of these are on here. If you can make it bigger? Or, like this is in Phoenix actually. They're doing a garden, and shows they're coming down like she was showing earlier. Coming down around the corner, there's the next picture, and then they're coming down the ground. You see they're coming down, and they're coming down right here, and then coming back up into the tank. It works very well. It's water seeks a normal level. So see the next slide, it's actually coming underneath here, going down in the asphalt, and they pumped it under. So there's many ways you can collect rainwater, not even by your house. You know, you can do it away if you have that certain height. You know, taller gutters, of course, are better. You go down and then come back up.
And is your experience too that 12 to 18 inches?
Yeah, it's about
minimum?
right the head pressure that you get.
Yeah.
So
And then is there a distance that you kind of say, like, you don't want to run it for?
I've done it like a long ways,
Yeah.
like a block.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
I've done it before. Yeah.
Yeah. So as long as
actually,
you've got the correct head
Yes.
pressure on that, you can run that wet
water,
install pipe.
like a good
quite a
analogy is water don't go from the ocean up to the mountain. It goes from the mountain to the ocean. So if it's the right height, it'll seek. So it's all about level and landscaping, you know. So I don't know. Does anybody have any?
And then I was just going to say another
deeper
thing
question,
here
or-
too is, like, even if you do have areas of concrete and you're kind of worried, like, can I get a pipe underground? You know, it's not impossible to
Yeah, that's what they
just
did
saw
here.
cut certain sections of it, or, you know, sometimes if it's a small enough section, you can kind of dig underneath it. So just, you know, keep in mind that there's options even if you do have some hardscape areas. Okay, do you want to talk about
So these are totes. They're an inexpensive way of doing it. This is a system that's grabbing off. I don't really like these. I like to go right in with a rain screen. These don't catch enough water. You want to catch it all and then surely do an overflow so you get it away from the house. But totes are an inexpensive way of collecting rainwater. Tanks can be very expensive, but this is just an example of picking off, and then it continues on. But see, what you got is you're still flooding right here by your foundation. That's bad. So.
And then with these, would you recommend that, like, this water gets used relatively quickly because they are?
In tanks, I
translucent?
typically, if it rains, I use my rainwater like within 3 days, because
Yeah.
it's not, you know, not about bragging, you know, how much water I've
Yeah, yeah.
collected. It's how much water did I water and fed plants
Yeah.
and grass and what you're watering.
Yeah.
You know, I always say use it or lose it, you know. So I typically try to use mine 3 days after rain. Your ground's dry enough to start watering again, you know, so.
I have
And
a question, Phil. Do you have to worry about temperature? Like if it's there for 3 days and in that tank and
You-
hot out?
there's a lot of people around Valley that have to have water tanks just to live, go to the house. So water temperature, yes, plays a role in anything, rain or potable. Heat and light are your two enemies, as she said, you know, light. So like in this case, this is gonna grow algae. So there's things you can do, like we sell tote covers, you can paint them. You know, these days paint has come a long way. You can get Krylon that's 4 plastic, it says right on it. And you can easily take this liner out with four screws, pop it out, paint it whatever color you want, and put it back in.
I was just going to add, I think the water temperature, it also depends on what your end use of the water is. So if you're using it in your landscape and it's just, you're putting it on the ground and you're not putting directly on plants, then, you know, generally it doesn't matter because it's, you know, hitting the ground first.
Yeah,
So.
plants
If
don't.
it's really hot, don't put it on a plant.
Well, maybe
Yeah.
don't spray your lettuce with it.
Yeah.
Our water right now is coming out at like 95 degrees.
Yeah, it really depends on,
It's
yeah,
brutal.
yeah.
Yeah. So heat and light are the two things that grow algae and bacteria. So yeah, if you can get it cool by cistern, the cistern means, definition is a below ground tank. So that way your water's cooler. But again, you know, cistern tanks can be quite expensive. Back in the day, Bushman, actually the manufacturer lets you bury these tanks up to 3 foot, since they're not allowing that. There's no manufacturer that lets you bury it and warranties it up to, you know, 3 feet anymore. They decided not to do that because the sun, moon, and stars come in. People were burying these tanks, and then, you know, they're empty, and then the rains come, and it just collapses in. You know, even these ones that are ribbed, Duraplast and Bushman are ribbed and very strong.
Another
But that
thing
helps cool it.
that this picture reminds me of too is, so if you're going to use water from your tank and you're planning to use, you know, gravity feed, and you don't want to install a pump, you just want to think about that, because that's really usually pretty low pressure that's coming out of that. So other ways to deal with that if you've got the height, the elevation on your roof, is you can build up your tanks. So you can put them on a, you know,
Yes.
you can build up the soil, or you can have
Like
them
this
in a.
guy did, he put soil. This guy's actually up in Globe, it's a vineyard. For every half a foot you get or for every foot you get a half a pound of pressure of PSI. So like at my house I have 16-foot tall tanks. I get 8 PSI and you can really tell it flows. So
Say that one more time. For every foot you build up,
You-
you get
you-
a half a pound of pressure?
yes, a half a PSI.
Thank you.
So like typically I'll take old garden hose, I never throw away hose, and I'll take a drill bit, 1/4 inch, and I'll just drill it where my plants are, and I'll walk by and kick open my valve after it rain and walk away. and it rains waters my plants off of gravity. So I'm spending no electricity. That's the whole point, is to try to save money. So there's certain things you can do to, you know, get that gravity head pressure.
How big was that tank?
That one there's a 1320, or I'm sorry, that's a smooth side. That's 1110. These are two 1110s.
So it's over 1,000 gallons?
Yes.
Each tank?
Yeah. About
And what are they using?
6'8".
that
He's watering a vineyard up in Globe. Is a huge vineyard. He's actually,
Okay, you got a vineyard there.
yeah, he's actually bought like 18 tanks for me up there to catch the rainwater by the swells of his. He has a godsend of rain that comes down and the.
I have a 20 by 8 swimming pool, and it only holds about 4,000 gallons.
Yeah, well, yeah. You drink
If
that
you ever
in the
get
end
tired
times.
of that swimming pool, you can also turn it into a tank. I forgot to mention it, but it is, you know, you can actually look at structures like that.
If they ever have a fire over there, my neighbors, they'd be glad I've got it.
Yeah.
That's true.
So on the whole, would it be, how does it work out? Would it be a little better to lift the tank or just use a pump?
Depends on, everybody's situation is different. If you can provide, like this guy, the hill to get it up higher, if you can, and still collect the rainwater.
It would be right by the house, so the only way to do it would be a concrete pad, I think, because I don't want any earth shoved up.
Yeah,
into the
I
house.
mean,
The main constraint
we
is
sell pallets for that reason.
Does that work, or is that going to
Yes.
cause damage once you've got a lot of weight in there?
I have a 5,000 gallon tank at the yard that it's on stack of 3 pallets, 3 pallets high.
Do you cover the pallets with anything?
No.
Sand,
No, they're plastic pallets. They're not wood. They're plastic ones. Yeah.
the main constraint is the top, the height of your fascia board, right? So if you have the space, like if you have a tall roof, and you can get that 18 inches of pressure, then I would say raise it up if you can. But if you're like us, ours are like 8 feet. So by the time I get
And
that pressure, then I've only got, you know, a
And
certain
a standard roof's
size of-
9.
Yeah.
So that's where your starting point is where's your gutter? You know, everybody's different. You know, you got some guys that have back shops that are, you know, they have huge roofs, you know, so it just depends on your situation.
So I think I might have misunderstood. I thought that you needed the 18 inches if you wanted to drop it down and then pump it back up at a distance. If it's dropping straight into the tank, do you
Go back to
still-
that one
No.
picture. Right, one more. Like this, see how that high that is, that one there? So he's way above this tank, so you wanna be at least 18 inches above this line.
If you're dropping
See the
down,
difference?
If you have the wet install. If you have the dry install, then it's different. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
You just need to create enough oomph up here, so I mean, if your gutters were down here at the same height of the tank, it wouldn't be efficient. You really need some height up there to get that to push, to go, you know, yeah.
So we can make it all the way.
But like she was saying in her one, what'd you call it, dry or wet? And like one of my tanks in my house just goes like this across, not that far, but so that's gravity, so I don't have to worry about the height. I just need the downslope, down bubble on a level, you know. So again, everybody's situation is different. I mean,
And tanks, I mean, they come in different sizes too. So like you can get the same, sometimes you can get the same or similar volume, but one will be kind of squat and one will be tall, right? So you
Yes.
might even look at that too. There might be an option for the same size volume you want, but it's a different dimension.
I want a tall one, but they're expensive.
I know, I have 2 acres of tanks, so we have fat, small, short, wide, tall, all kinds of tanks. So cisterns that go in the ground, you know, pumps are nice because they allow you to do different things, you know, like if you're gonna do major gardening like this, you can, you know, drip out, you know, better, more efficient watering. That's what I'm working on right now.
You sell the whole drip system, right? You'll sell everything that would need to go with the tank.
I don't do drip system, no.
Okay.
No.
For the sake of time,
Yeah.
are we
Yes.
able to just kind of wrap
Yeah,
things up
sorry.
right now? No, that's okay.
No, I could
We
do
can
questions and
that.
answers
Yeah.
outside if people want to stay, but I'm sure, you know, it's probably getting hungry.
Question that I think everybody might want to know the
Uh-huh.
answer to. In like certain towns, they give free compost bins because they want you composting. Is there such thing as a town or a county program that provides free rain catching bins? Is that a thing?
No,
No.
there there are
There's-
some municipalities that do different rebates for mostly for like water conservation, so maybe removing grass or something along those lines. I'm not
do
up to
raffle.
speed on all of them. I know Tempe's doing it
I
right now,
understand.
but you'd have to check usually with
Certainly.
the water conservation or sustainability department. Yeah.
And then real quick, Phil, so you
Uh-huh.
said you have 2 acres of property. Where are you guys located again?
Ironwood and Guadalupe in Apache Junction. We have 2 acres of tanks now, so.
Awesome, awesome.
Yes.
Cool, so get out your tickets. Ethan's gonna call the number, and if you got the lucky number, you get a 55-gallon barrel, tank and barrel. I wish we could do a drum roll, but that's okay. Let's just get into it. All right, come on, Ethan.
All right. So the lucky winner is 840090.
Oh, that's my number. Oh, wait.
Anyone have last 2
Just
numbers
kidding.
90?
If not, I'll draw another.
Oh, nice! Awesome. Before you go, we would like to have a picture of you with your barrel for advertising. Gotta make that shameless plug there. But we can hang out. We're gonna start putting stuff away. But if you guys have questions, feel free to hang out and chat for as long as our 2 speakers would like to stay. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight.
Does
Follow
it
our
slideshow or no?
website and we'll,
They don't slideshow?
What's